The morning arrived shrouded in unseasonable fog, creeping across the Hampshire countryside like a thief itself. Snow had fallen during the night, transforming Ashworth Manor into a pristine fortress of white, yet nothing could have prepared the household for what lay waiting within its walls. It was Boxing Day, December 26th, and Lord Ashworth would not be joining anyone for breakfast. The discovery came at 7:30, when Mrs. Hammond, the head housekeeper, unlocked the library as she did every morning. She found him slumped in the mahogany chair before the dying fire, his face frozen in an expression somewhere between sleep and surprise. The silver letter opener protruded from between his ribs at an angle that seemed almost casual, as if placed there by an indifferent hand rather than one driven by passion or rage. Death appeared to have come swiftly, the blood staining his burgundy smoking jacket, forming a pattern that suggested he had moved very little after the initial wound. What made the murder truly baffling, however, was the locked room itself. The library door had been secured from the inside, the key discovered on the Persian rug near the The body? The windows remained latched, their frames intact and undisturbed. The only other entrance, a connecting door to Lord Ashworth's study, was also locked, with that key found in the study itself on the opposite side. No one had entered. No one could have left. Yet someone had driven cold steel into the heart of one of Hampshire's most prominent men. The household had been in chaos that morning. Lord Ashworth's 3 children gathered in the drawing-room, their inherited anxiety barely concealed beneath measured breathing and tight-lipped expressions. His wife, Lady Ashworth, remained in her private chambers, sedated by the family physician. The staff numbered 12 in total, each accounted for during the night, yet suspicion settled over them all like the fog outside. Among the guests sleeping in the manor's various wings were Lord Ashworth's business partner, Edmund Vane, who had arrived 2 days prior with considerable tension evident in every conversation. His sister-in-law, Miss Catherine Worth, known for her sharp tongue and sharper financial circumstances, and young Thomas Whitmore, engaged to Lord Ashworth's youngest daughter, whose own history with his deceased was marked by barely concealed animosity. The local constabulary arrived within an hour, and within 2, Chief Inspector Jameson had examined every detail with growing frustration. The locked room presented an impossible paradox. The key sat where it had been left, yet the killer had somehow vanished, leaving only that singular, inexplicable object clutched in the dead man's other hand. A fragment of blue fabric no larger than a postage stamp silk in texture, bearing no obvious connection to anyone in the household or the crime itself. It matched nothing in Lord Ashworth's clothing, nothing in the library itself. It seemed almost mocking in its obscurity, a taunt from a murderer confident in their own cleverness. The inspector's confusion deepened as he reviewed the facts. A locked room murder with multiple suspects, each with motive and opportunity obscured by the physical impossibility of the crime itself. The weapon bore no fingerprints. The fragment of fabric defied identification. The timeline was tight, as you besides. Lord Ashworth had dined with his family the previous evening at 8 o'clock, and the body was found at 7:30 the following morning. Someone within those 11.5 hours had committed the perfect crime, or so it seemed. It was then that Chief Inspector Jameson placed the telephone call that would change everything. By late afternoon, a Belgian gentleman with remarkable moustaches and sharper eyes than the fog outside would be reviewing the scene, ready to apply the little grey cells to a mystery that appeared to have no solution at all. Hercule Poirot arrived at Ashworth Manor precisely at 4 o'clock, emerging from the Bentley with the deliberate grace of a man who understood that every movement carried significance. His egg-shaped head tilted slightly as he observed the manor through the dissipating fog, his dark eyes taking in details that Chief Inspector Jameson had already catalogued and dismissed. The Belgian detective said nothing as he climbed the stone steps, merely offering a thin smile to the waiting constable, who introduced himself with nervous deference. The library remained exactly as it had been discovered, preserved under Jameson's orders like some macabre museum exhibit. Poirot circled the body slowly, his hands clasped before him, conducting an internal symphony of observation that required no words. He examined the letter opener with particular interest, noting its position, the angle of penetration, the nature of the wound itself. Then, without ceremony, he turned his attention to the fragment of blue fabric now secured in a small evidence envelope. "Tell me, Inspector," Poirot said, lifting the envelope to the lamplight with delicate precision. "This textile, you have determined its origin?" Jameson shook his head, frustrated. "Nothing matches, Monsieur Poirot. We've examined every guest's wardrobe, every member of the household staff. The silk appears custom-made, expensive, but the first pattern is non-standard. It's as if the killer deliberately carried something foreign into this room. Poirot's moustache twitched slightly, a gesture that might have been amusement or concentration. Or perhaps, Inspector, it was not deliberately carried at all. Perhaps it was simply lost. Come, show me the study. The connecting door between the library and study was indeed locked, the key lying on Lord Ashworth's mahogany desk exactly where it had been found. Poirot examined the lock itself with a jeweller's magnifying glass, producing the instrument from his pocket as if by magic. His eyebrows rose infinitesimally. The mechanism shows signs of recent disturbance, he observed quietly. Not forced, you understand, but manipulated. Someone with knowledge of such things has examined this lock recently. Jameson bristled. We've been careful with the room, Poirot. Nothing has been moved since... I am not suggesting you're men, Inspector. I am suggesting something far more interesting. Poirot straightened, replacing his magnifying glass. Now I should very much like to speak with the family, beginning with Miss Catherine Worth. Miss Worth received them in the drawing-room, her composure remarkable for a woman whose brother-in-law lay dead mere corridors away. She was perhaps 45, dressed in black that was clearly hastily selected, her fingers adorned with rings of considerable value. When Poirot asked his first seemingly innocuous question about her jewellery, her left eye twitched, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to those trained to observe such things. These rings, mademoiselle, are they recent acquisitions? Some are family pieces, she replied carefully. Too carefully, Le. Why do you ask? Merely curious. The sapphire, in particular, it is exquisitely cut. French work, perhaps? Her fingers curled slightly, and she glanced toward her lap, where a small tear in her black wool dress suddenly became visible. The edges raw and recent, the thread colour, remarkably similar to the blue fabric now residing in the inspector's evidence envelope. Poirot noticed the tear before Miss Worth could conceal it. His expression remained serene, but his eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a hunter who has caught the first scent of prey. Yet rather than press the advantage, he merely smiled and changed the subject entirely, inquiring about Lord Ashworth's evening the previous day, his disposition, his habits. Miss Worth's answers came more easily now, her relief palpable, though something darker flickered behind her eyes. Not guilt, perhaps, but knowledge of something she was unwilling to reveal. As they left the drawing-room, Jameson whispered urgently, Did you see that tear in her dress? Surely, sir. Patience, Inspector, Poirot replied softly. The game is only beginning, and I have many questions remaining before the picture becomes clear. The questioning proceeded methodically through the afternoon and into the evening. Poirot had requested that all guests and household staff remain available, and Chief Inspector Jameson coordinated the interviews in the morning room, a space sufficiently distant from the library to allow for some semblance of privacy. Poirot observed each person with the intensity of a conductor reading an orchestra score, noting not merely what was said, but how it was said, the hesitations and emphases that betrayed the human tendency towards selective truth. Edmund Vane, Lord Ashworth's business partner, presented himself as deeply grieved yet strangely composed. He described an evening spent reviewing financial documents in his guest room, claiming to have retired early due to fatigue from travel. Yet when Poirot casually inquired whether he had heard any disturbances during the night, Vane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he insisted he had slept soundly and heard nothing whatsoever. Poirot made a mental note of this contradiction. A man truly asleep could hardly claim absolute certainty about sounds he might not have heard. Your business relationship with Lord Ashworth was cordial, monsieur? Poirot asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. Entirely even so, Vane replied, but his fingers drummed against the armrest in a rapid, anxious pattern. We had discussed a substantial venture. The man was difficult, yes, but honourable in his dealings. And yet, Poirot continued, I understand you were observed in heated discussion with him 2 evenings past. The servants reported raised voices emanating from the study. Vane's composure fractured momentarily, a flash of anger crossing his features. Business disputes are hardly unusual. We resolved our differences. Did you? Poirot's eyebrows rose with polite scepticism. And this resolution occurred before or after he threatened to dissolve your partnership? The question hung in the air like a blade suspended by a thread. Vane said nothing, his silence itself a confession of sorts. Young Thomas Whitmore, the engaged suitor, displayed a different variety of deception. His grief appeared genuine, his shock authentic, yet he was extraordinarily evasive about his whereabouts during the crucial hours. He claimed to have remained in his guest room reading. But when Poirot inquired about the specific book, Whitmore named a title that required examination. Later, when a servant was discreetly questioned, it emerged that the book had been found in the library, ostensibly undisturbed since yesterday morning, yet bearing bookmark. Placement inconsistent with the pages Whitmore claimed to have read. Lord Ashworth's eldest son, Richard, offered a version of events that contradicted his sister's account regarding the timing of their father's retirement to the library. Richard insisted his father had gone to the library at precisely 8:15, while his sister swore it was closer to 8 o'clock. Such discrepancies might seem trivial, yet in a locked room murder, every minute shifted suspicion's spotlight. The servants proved more cooperative, but equally confused. Cook had prepared supper, affirming that the family dined at 8 o'clock. The butler confirmed Lord Ashworth's custom of retiring to the library for brandy and contemplation. The housemaid who had prepared the library that morning reported nothing unusual, though she admitted the room had been dark when she opened the curtains, and she had not examined it closely before departing. By 9 o'clock that evening, Poirot requested a brief respite, retiring to the guest room Jameson had arranged for him. As he sat alone, reviewing his notes with meticulous care, the Belgian detective's fingers steepled before his perfectly groomed moustache. The contradictions were multiplying rather than resolving, each suspect harbouring secrets. Yet none of these secrets appeared directly connected to the murder itself. Something deeper lay beneath the surface, a truth that required the complete reassembly of established facts. Tomorrow, he decided, would require a different approach entirely. Morning brought clarity of sorts, though not the kind that simplified matters. Poirot had spent the night reviewing financial documents that Chief Inspector Jameson procured from Lord Ashworth's study, documents that revealed a far more complex web of motivations than the surface investigators had suggested. By 8 o'clock he had summoned the inspector to the library, where the body had finally been removed, leaving only the lingering absence of the deceased. "Tell me, Inspector, what do you know of Lord Ashworth's will?" Poirot asked, examining the letter opener that had returned to its place on the desk. Jameson consulted his notes. The family solicitor arrived an hour ago. The will is straightforward. The estate divided equally among his 3 children, with Lady Ashworth receiving the house and a substantial annual allowance. "Straightforward," Poirot repeated, his tone suggesting the word meant something entirely different to him. "And yet Mr. Edmund Vane receives nothing despite their partnership spanning 15 years. The documents I reviewed indicate Vane stood to lose considerably if Lord Ashworth dissolved their enterprise. The venture was failing, Inspector. Vane's finances are precarious." Jameson leaned forward. "Motive for murder, then? But, well, does he explain the locked room?" "He does not need to explain it," Poirot replied. "Not yet. Consider instead Miss Catherine Worth. She has been living in Lord Ashworth's household for 3 years, supported entirely by his generosity. According to the solicitor, Lord Ashworth was preparing to terminate her allowance. He had learned of her gambling debts, substantial ones incurred in London establishments. Her brother-in-law was about to cut her off entirely. "Another motive," Jameson acknowledged. "But again, the locked room. Patience, Inspector. We are assembling the maze, not yet navigating it. Young Thomas Whitmore presents yet another layer. His engagement to Lord Ashworth's youngest daughter, Eleanor, was contingent upon his demonstrating financial stability. Lord Ashworth had recently discovered that Whitmore's circumstances were far worse than represented. The engagement was to be terminated, along with any hope of the financial settlement Whitmore disrespectfully required. Jameson stood, pacing the length of the library. 3 suspects with 3 strong motives, yet none could have committed the crime given their constraint, unless one of them conspired with another, perhaps Miss Worth and Vane. Conspiracy requires communication, Inspector, and I have found no evidence of prior connection between them." Poirot rose as well, moving to the study's connecting door. "Yet consider the nature of the locked room itself. It appears impenetrable, yes? And yet the lock shows signs of recent manipulation. Someone with intimate knowledge of mechanisms has examined this door. You suspect someone within the household? I suspect nothing yet. I observe and catalogue." So Poirot's fingers traced the lock's perimeter. Lord Ashworth's son, Richard, studied engineering before his father insisted he abandon such pursuits. He possesses knowledge of locks and mechanisms. Lady Ashworth's personal maid, Margaret, was once employed by a locksmith before entering domestic service. Even young Eleanor has shown unusual aptitude for mechanical matters, according to her governess. Jameson's frustration mounted visibly. Then we return to motive, and none of them benefit from his death in obvious ways. Richard inherits equally with his siblings. Eleanor's engagement is dissolved, yes, but she was never particularly fond of young Whitmore. Margaret has no financial connection to the family whatsoever. Poirot smiled enigmatically. You see, Inspector, the maze reveals itself slowly. We have motives that do not align with opportunity, and opportunity that does not align with physical possibility. Someone has constructed this crime with extraordinary care, layering deceptions upon deceptions. The blue fabric tells us the murderer was present. The locked room tells us they were also absent. One of these truths must be false, or one of our assumptions about the room itself requires reconsideration. He turned from the door, his eyes gleaming with intellectual satisfaction. I believe it is time to examine precisely who had access to the keys, and when such access occurred. By midday, Chief Inspector Jameson believed he had solved the murder. The household keys, maintained by the butler since Lord Ashworth's father's time, revealed a telling inconsistency. Margaret, Lady Ashworth's personal maid, had borrowed the study key 3 days prior, under the pretext of retrieving a dropped earring. More significantly, servants reported seeing her in the hallway near the library during the evening of the murder, though she had claimed to be in her room preparing Lady Ashworth's evening attire. When confronted, Margaret confessed to the theft almost immediately. She had taken the study key, made an impression in soft wax, and provided it to a man who had paid her £50, money she desperately needed to pay debts accumulated through her ailing mother's medical expenses. She insisted she knew nothing of any murder, that the man had merely said he wished to retrieve something from Lord Ashworth's study without the family knowing. The description she provided, a lean man with a scarred left cheek, travelling clothes despite his refined accent, matched no one in the household. Yet Jameson seized upon the confession as proof of conspiracy. He immediately began interviewing servants regarding any strangers seen near the manor during the relevant period. A groundskeeper recalled seeing an unfamiliar man near the service entrance on Christmas evening, though the description was vague and contradictory. Poirot listened to Jameson's triumphant exposition with apparent interest, yet his fingers drummed against the armrest with increasing rapidity. When the inspector concluded his theory, the Belgian detective rose and walked to the library's window, gazing out at the snow-covered gardens with an expression of profound disappointment. You are satisfied with this conclusion, Inspector? Poirot's voice carried the weight of gentle reproach. Entirely, Jameson responded, his confidence unshaken. We have motive, Margaret's financial desperation, and opportunity. This mysterious stranger, whoever he is, likely made an impression of the study key, then used it to enter and leave the library through the connecting door. The locked room is explained by the fact that he possessed access to both keys through Margaret's assistance. And yet, Poirot turned slowly, Margaret's testimony contains an extraordinary contradiction. She claims to have given the study key impression to this stranger, and yet the study key was found precisely where it should have been, in the study, when we discovered the body. If this man possessed a copy, why did he not simply take the original? Jameson's confidence wavered momentarily. Perhaps he intended to... Furthermore, Poirot continued, his voice growing sharper, if the man entered through the study and exited through the library's connecting door into the study, he would have locked the library door behind him from the inside, then used the study key to exit. But the library key was found inside the library on the floor. It could not have been placed there by someone who had already departed through the study. Unless, of course, he returned afterward, which seems unnecessarily elaborate. The inspector's face darkened. Then Margaret is lying? Partially, perhaps. But about which element? Poirot moved to the library table, where the blue fabric remained in its evidence envelope. Margaret's dress is grey wool, Inspector. She has no connection to this blue silk. The man she describes may be entirely fictitious, a fabrication to conceal something else entirely. Jameson stood abruptly, frustrated. Then who killed Lord Ashworth? That, Inspector, is precisely what troubles me. We have assembled many pieces, genuine pieces, I suspect, yet they form no coherent picture. Poirot lifted the fabric envelope toward the lamplight once more. Margaret's desperation is real. The mysterious stranger may be fabricated. The theft of the key impression is genuine. Yet none of these truths explain how the crime was actually committed. Someone in this house possesses knowledge we have not yet uncovered, and they are content to allow us to pursue false certainties while the truth remains carefully hidden. He lowered the envelope deliberately. I suggest, Inspector, that we do not yet arrest anyone. The real murderer is waiting, watching to see if their deception holds. A false arrest may cause them to panic, to make a critical error. Or worse, it may cause them to eliminate additional witnesses. Poirot's warning proved prescient. That evening, as darkness settled over Ashworth Manor once more, a second crisis erupted. Edmund Vane was discovered unconscious in his guest room, an empty bottle of sleeping draught beside his bed. The household erupted into chaos. Jameson summoned the physician, while servants rushed about with blankets and cold water. The crisis passed within the hour, the doctor confirming that Vane had consumed merely enough to induce deep sleep rather than cause permanent harm. Yet the attempted suicide, or staged one, raised urgent questions about guilt and desperation. When Vane regained consciousness, he spoke with surprising clarity despite his drowsy state. He insisted he had not intentionally poisoned himself, that someone had placed the draught in his evening brandy. The accusation sent Jameson into renewed frenzy, yet Poirot remained oddly calm, requesting instead that he be granted access to Lord Ashworth's personal correspondence. For hours, Poirot sequestered himself into the manor's library, now converted into a makeshift office, reading through decades of letters, journals, and business documents. Chief Inspector Jameson watched with growing impatience until finally, near midnight, Poirot emerged with a discovery that reoriented the entire investigation. "Tell me, Inspector, what do you know of Lord Ashworth's past?" Poirot asked quietly. Jameson shrugged. "The usual. Inherited the manor 30 years ago. Expanded the family fortune through shrewd investments. Married Lady Ashworth 28 years ago. Nothing remarkable. And before his marriage, his life in London during the 1890s. The inspector consulted his notes. He was involved in various business ventures. Why does it matter? Poirot placed several letters before Jameson. They were decades old, the paper yellowed and fragile. They were written in a woman's hand, passionate and desperate, speaking of broken promises, abandoned love, and a child born in shame. The signature was partially obscured, but one name appeared repeatedly. Catherine. "Good heavens," Jameson breathed. "Miss Catherine Worth?" "Not Miss Worth," Poirot corrected. "Miss Catherine Ashworth, Lord Ashworth's illegitimate daughter. Born in 1878 to a woman named Margaret Hartley, a governess employed by the family at the time. When the woman refused to disappear quietly, Lord Ashworth had her committed to an asylum where she died in 1895. The child, this Catherine, was raised by relatives in obscurity, told her mother had succumbed to illness." Jameson's mind raced through the implications. "Miss Worth isn't his sister-in-law at all." "She is his daughter," Poirot confirmed. "And according to these letters, she discovered the truth approximately 6 months ago. She came to Ashworth Manor under false pretenses, claiming to be a distant relation, requiring assistance. Lord Ashworth, perhaps unaware or perhaps deliberately ignoring the risk, welcomed her into his home. But why would she hide her identity? Why not confront him?" Poirot gestured toward the letters. "Because she was gathering evidence, Inspector. Evidence of her father's cruelty, of her mother's deliberate institutionalization, of the systematic erasure of her existence. She was preparing, I suspect, to expose him publicly, to demand acknowledgement and recompense. These letters prove her claims. Then she had motive, revenge for her mother, financial compensation for her suffering." "Precisely," Poirot interrupted. "Yet the locked room remains inexplicable unless we reconsider our assumptions about access. The blue fabric, Inspector, I have now identified it. It is from a dress belonging to Eleanor Ashworth, the youngest daughter, but the tear pattern suggests it was not simply lost. It was deliberately separated, cut with precision, and placed in her father's hand." Jameson paled. "You suggest Eleanor was involved?" "I suggest nothing yet," Poirot replied. "But consider this. Eleanor and Catherine share a mother. Though Eleanor knows nothing of this connection, they are sisters, though separated by circumstance and deception. What if their discovery of each other created an alliance neither of us has yet recognized?" What if the crime required the cooperation of family members bound together by hidden truths rather than criminal intent? The night stretched before them, pregnant with implication and revelation yet unmarked by final clarity. Morning arrived cold and grey, the fog returning to cloak the manor in impenetrable silence. Poirot had spent the night orchestrating an elaborate psychological test that would have seemed theatrical to anyone unaware of his methods. He requested that all suspects and household staff assemble in the drawing room at 9 o'clock precisely, including the now recovered Edmund Vane, who appeared pale but determined. Once gathered, Poirot announced with deliberate theatricality that the police had apprehended the mysterious scarred stranger Margaret had described. He produced a photograph, actually a portrait of an obscure actor from a London theatrical company, entirely fabricated for the purpose. The false prisoner, Poirot claimed, had already confessed to the murder, though he was demanding to know which member of the household had conspired with him. He insists, Poirot continued smoothly, that he could not have entered the locked room without assistance from someone within these walls, someone who provided not only the key impression, but also detailed knowledge of the room's layout, the exact time Lord Ashworth would be present, and assurance that no servant would disturb the crime. He watched the assembly carefully as he spoke. Most reactions were predictable: shock, fear, denial. But Eleanor Ashworth's response was extraordinary. She did not merely appear surprised, she appeared relieved. Her shoulders visibly relaxed, her breathing deepened, and her eyes momentarily closed as if in gratitude. The reaction was so pronounced that even Chief Inspector Jameson noticed it. "Miss Eleanor," Poirot said softly, turning his full attention toward her, "you seem pleased by this development." Eleanor's eyes opened, panic flooding through them as she realised her error. She attempted to speak, stammered, and then fell silent. Catherine Worth, sitting beside her, suddenly reached over and grasped her hand with protective intensity. "If I may be permitted to observe," Poirot continued, "I notice that you two young women have displayed remarkable solidarity throughout this ordeal. You sit together, speak only when necessary, and communicate through glances with a frequency that suggests long familiarity. Yet according to household records, Miss Catherine has been here only 3 years, and you were introduced as distant relatives meeting for the first time. This is curious, is it not?" Lady Ashworth intervened, her voice sharp. "My daughter and my cousin have become close friends. There is nothing suspicious in that." "Perhaps not," Poirot acknowledged, "and yet I am troubled by an inconsistency. Miss Eleanor, you claim to have been in your room reading on the evening of the murder. You were unable to provide the title of the book, and servants report you made no request for tea or company during the critical hours. A young woman alone without distraction or companionship for an entire evening." Eleanor's composure fractured further. Catherine squeezed her hand urgently, a wordless warning, but Eleanor seemed compelled to speak. "I was not alone," Eleanor whispered. "I was with Catherine." The confession hung in the air like suspended glass. Richard Ashworth stood abruptly, demanding answers. Lady Ashworth's face drained of colour. Even Edmund Vane leaned forward with sudden interest, his own problems momentarily forgotten. "And what precisely were you doing together?" Poirot asked gently, his tone suggesting he already possessed the answer. Eleanor looked toward Catherine, seeking permission. Catherine nodded, and Eleanor's words tumbled forth in a desperate rush. They had discovered the truth about their relationship the previous week through old letters hidden in the manor's archives. Catherine had initially come seeking revenge, but as Eleanor learned her story, their mother's terrible fate, the systematic erasure of their sister's existence, something shifted. They had spent the evening together not plotting murder, but reconciling, sharing a bond that had been stolen from them by their father's lies and cruelty. "We did not kill him," Eleanor said firmly. "But when we heard what had happened, part of me was relieved. Not because he was dead, but because the truth about our family could finally emerge without his interference." Poirot nodded slowly, his expression grave yet thoughtful. "An honest answer, mademoiselle, though it raises far more questions than it resolves. You see, Inspector, we now know who was absent from their rooms that evening, but we still do not know who stood in the locked library with a letter opener in their hand." The drawing room descended into chaos as accusations flew and denials multiplied. Lady Ashworth demanded Eleanor and Catherine be removed from the manor immediately. Richard insisted on involving the family solicitor. Young Thomas Whitmore, pale and shaken by the revelation of Eleanor's son deception regarding their evening together, demanded answers about the state of their engagement, Through it all, Poirot remained composed, observing each reaction with the precision of a naturalist catalogued specimens. Chief Inspector Jameson, sensing that the investigation had reached a critical juncture, requested that Poirot remain in the drawing room while he secured additional statements in private interviews. The detective agreed, though his eyes followed Jameson's departure with subtle concern. It was this moment of divided attention that proved catastrophic. Approximately 30 minutes later, as Poirot was engaged in quiet conversation with Edmund Vane regarding the man's mysterious poisoning, a servant appeared with urgent summons. The evidence locker, hastily established in the Manor's study, had been breached. The blue fabric specimen, the one crucial physical connection between the murderer and the crime, had vanished. Additionally, the impression of the study key that Margaret had produced, along with several of Lord Ashworth's personal letters relating to Catherine's parentage, had been removed. Poirot rose immediately, his composure replaced by visible agitation. He proceeded to the study with Jameson in tow, examining the locker with methodical precision. The lock showed no signs of forced entry. The secure cabinet had been opened with a key, not through violence or breaking. "Who possessed access to this locker, Inspector?" Poirot's voice carried an edge of steel. Jameson consulted with the uniformed officer maintaining guard. "Only myself and Sergeant Blackwood, sir. We kept the key between us at all warm times." "And Sergeant Blackwood?" "He left the manor approximately 20 minutes ago on official business, delivering reports to the station. He will return within the hour." Poirot's eyes narrowed. Most convenient. "And before his departure, did anyone request access to the evidence?" The officer hesitated. "Young Mr. Richard Ashworth asked to examine the fabric. The sergeant allowed it, as Mr. Ashworth is the eldest son and technically now the owner of the manor and its contents." "Technically," Poirot repeated softly. Inspector, I must ask, did you observe Sergeant Blackwood's demeanour this morning? Any unusual agitation or concern?" Jameson shook his head. He seemed entirely normal. Professional, competent. "Why?" "Because, Inspector, someone within this household possesses sufficient influence over the police to ensure that crucial evidence is removed at precisely the moment when it becomes most damaging. The blue fabric connected the murderer directly to the crime. With it gone, our case rests entirely on circumstantial evidence and confession. Without it, even the guilty party might escape conviction." Poirot began pacing, his fingers steepled before his moustache. "Consider the implications. The murderer is not only someone clever enough to commit a locked room crime, but also someone positioned to corrupt the investigation itself. This narrows our field considerably." An horrifying realization seemed to dawn upon Jameson. "You cannot suggest precisely that Sergeant Blackwood, the head member of the constabulary—" "Suggest nothing, Inspector. I merely observed that Blackwood arrived at Ashworth Manor yesterday afternoon, approximately 90 minutes after the discovery of the body. Before that time, I have no knowledge of his movements. Before that time, no one had examined the evidence with care. The blue fabric was merely collected and catalogued, its significance unappreciated." Poirot turned sharply. "Tell me, when was the last time you spoke directly with Blackwood about the case details?" Jameson consulted his notes with trembling hands. "This morning, when we discussed Margaret's confession and the mysterious stranger, I showed him the description she provided. The description of a man with a scarred left cheek, travelling clothes, refined accent," Poirot recited. "Inspector, I wonder if you have ever examined Sergeant Blackwood's left cheek closely, whether such a scar might be concealable beneath certain lighting conditions, beneath the collar of a uniform jacket. The implication hung between them like an executioner's axe." Jameson moved toward the telephone immediately, but Poirot raised his hand. "Wait, Inspector. If Blackwood is indeed our murderer, then his flight now would confirm his guilt. But more importantly, it would eliminate the possibility of his confession. He will run, yes, but he will also leave traces. We must first understand his motive, his connection to Lord Ashworth. Because a man does not risk his entire career, his freedom, his life, unless the crime touches him deeply." Before Jameson could respond, screams erupted from the upper floors of the manor. A servant rushed down the grand staircase, her face contorted in terror, gasping incoherently about violence in the east wing. Poirot and Jameson exchanged a single glance of terrible understanding before racing upward. their footsteps echoing through the corridors that suddenly seemed menacing in their emptiness. They found Thomas Whitmore sprawled across the corridor floor outside Eleanor's room, blood streaming from a gash across his temple. He was conscious but dazed, struggling to form coherent words. Behind the door above him, Lady Ashworth emerged from her chambers, demanding answers, while servants clustered at doorways, terrified and unbudging. "Where is Miss Eleanor? What door?" Poirot demanded, already knowing the answer before Whitmore managed to speak. "Gone," Whitmore gasped. "She was leaving her room when I came to speak with her. That officer, Blackwood, he was waiting in the corridor. When I tried to intervene, he struck me with his truncheon. Then he took her. I heard her struggling, heard him say something about coming with him willingly, or he would ensure she was charged with her father's murder. Jameson was already on his radio calling for immediate pursuit and roadblocks. But Poirot remained unnervingly calm, his mind racing through the newly revealed dimensions of the crime. Eleanor, Catherine Worth appeared at the top of the stairs, her face ashen. He took Eleanor because she knows. She knows he was there that night, doesn't she? She wasn't truly with me the entire evening. She left at some point. The confession sent another tremor through the assembled household. Poirot turned to Catherine with sharp intensity. "What do you know of this, mademoiselle?" Catherine's voice broke as she explained. Eleanor had discovered something in their father's private study, correspondence between Lord Ashworth and a man named George Blackwood, regarding an incident from decades past. The letters referenced a young woman, a tragedy, a cover-up. Eleanor had recognised the name immediately, had begun making connections, and was preparing to share her findings, when the household erupted into chaos following the discovery of the body. "George Blackwood," Poirot repeated, his expression crystallising with sudden clarity. "Sergeant Blackwood's brother, I presume?" "His younger brother," Catherine confirmed. "According to the letters, he was involved with a woman named Margaret Hartley, our mother. He was engaged to her, Inspector. Your father broke them apart, imprisoned her, destroyed them both, and George Blackwood has spent 30 years nursing that wound, becoming a policeman to gain access to power, to position himself to destroy your father when the opportunity presented itself." Poirot moved toward the window, gazing out at the frozen landscape beyond. But why wait 30 years? Why murder him now at Christmas, when patience has already proven so abundant? "Because Eleanor found the letters," a new voice answered from the shadows. Margaret, the lady's maid, stepped forward, her earlier meekness stripped away to reveal something harder, more resolute. "Because I contacted my brother after years of estrangement and told him the truth about my connection to the Ashworth family. Because I am George Blackwood's sister, and our mother was Margaret Hartley." The revelation struck like lightning. Margaret was not merely a servant, but another hidden child of the tragedy, another victim of Lord Ashworth's cruelty orchestrated through proxy. The conspiracy was far deeper, far more intricate than anyone had imagined. Blackwood had not acted alone, but with familial knowledge and possibly assistance. Then the key impression, Poirot said quietly, was not truly stolen to conceal evidence, but to prevent us from discovering how the lock was actually manipulated. Margaret did not steal the key for a fictional stranger, but for her brother. And Eleanor's discovery of the correspondence accelerated a crime that had been planned with meticulous care for decades. Jameson was already organising search parties, but Poirot raised his hand once more. "Eleanor is not in immediate danger, Inspector. Blackwood requires her alive as leverage, as proof of his accusations against Lord Ashworth. She is his witness, his vindication. But we must move quickly, for once he has shared his story, once he has extracted his confession from her, her usefulness will end." The detective's eyes burned with urgent intensity. "We must find them before nightfall, before he decides that Eleanor's testimony is no longer necessary." As police launched their search across the frozen Hampshire countryside, Poirot remained in the man's study, his mind engaged in an entirely different pursuit. He stood before Lord Ashworth's desk, examining the scattered papers with renewed attention, his fingers tracing patterns that others had overlooked. Chief Inspector Jameson had left him there, regarding the Belgian detective's insistence on remaining behind as peculiar but understandable given his advanced years. Yet Poirot's stillness was deceptive, his mind operating at extraordinary velocity. He returned to the library, to the precise location where Lord Ashworth had been discovered. The letter opener had been replaced on the desk, and Poirot studied it with meticulous care, rotating it beneath the lamplight. The angle of the wound haunted him, not the angle of violence, but the angle of positioning. A man stabbed in anger, in passion, would have moved, would have struggled. Yet Lord Ashworth's position suggested he had remained seated, compliant almost, as if he had not recognised the threat before him. A detail surfaced from the servants' accounts as something mentioned casually by the housemaid who discovered the body. She had noted that the library fire had been recently stoked, that fresh coal dust marked the hearth. Yet Lord Ashworth's evening routine, as established over decades, never involved tending to fires. That task fell exclusively to the servants. The fire had been tended to by someone else, someone who had walked freely through the room without raising suspicion. Poirot moved to the fireplace and examined its interior. Behind this grate, wedged partially into the chimney's opening, was a small brass key. Not the library key, not the study key, but a third key altogether. He extracted it carefully, his hands trembling with the significance of the discovery. The key unlocked a hidden compartment in the desk's base, a space so cunningly concealed that it had escaped police notice entirely. Within it lay additional correspondence, letters far older than those relating to Catherine's parentage. These were addressed to a man named George Blackwood, written in Lord Ashworth's own hands and detailing arrangements, payments, instructions for the moving Margaret Hartley to the private asylum, assurances that she would be contained indefinitely. But more revealing still were the personal items. A photograph of a young couple, Margaret and George, faces radiant with hope, a ring engraved with initials and a date, a lock of hair tied with ribbon. Blackwood had been here before Poirot realised. He had searched at this very desk, had found these treasures, and had been interrupted before he could secure them. The crime had not been planned as murder, but as theft of evidence that would have allowed him to prove the depths of his family's victimization. Poirot descended to the kitchen, where he found Margaret Blackwood sitting beneath the watchful eye of a constable. She looked diminished now, stripped of purpose, her conspiracy revealed and crumbling. He sat across from her and placed the photograph on the table between them. "Your brother did not come here intending to murder Lord Ashworth," Poirot said quietly. He came to retrieve these items, to gather evidence that would finally allow him to expose what had been done to your mother. He arrived Christmas evening, entered through the study using the key impression you had provided, and came to this very desk, searching for proof. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. He was supposed to leave after. He promised me he would simply take what he needed and disappear. But Lord Ashworth interrupted him, Poirot continued. Perhaps curious about the fire, perhaps simply restless. And when your brother saw him, saw the man who'd orchestrated his mother's destruction, something within him shattered. The letter opener was there, available, and for just one moment his decades of patient planning gave way to passionate necessity. He leaned forward. Eleanor did not leave her room earlier. She was never with your brother, but she did discover these letters, these secrets. That discovery is what prompted Blackwood to take her now. He needed to ensure she would not testify about what she had found, what connections she had made. He needed leverage. Margaret's silence confirmed what Poirot had already deduced. "Your brother will release her once he believes he has escaped," Poirot said with certainty. "But he must first know that we understand the truth, not the truth of premeditation, but the truth of provocation, of a man driven to one moment of violence after 30 years of injustice. Once he knows this truth is known, his leverage becomes worthless. And then, perhaps, he will finally choose mercy over vengeance." Poirot drafted a carefully worded message that Chief Inspector Jameson transmitted to every police station across the region. The message was designed not to apprehend but to communicate, to reach George Blackwood with understanding rather than accusation. It contained the essential truth, that the investigation had revealed not a calculated murderer but a man broken by decades of systematic cruelty. The evidence of his family victimization had been discovered and preserved, and that such evidence, properly presented, would vindicate his mother's memory and expose Lord Ashworth's moral bankruptcy to the world. By early evening, Blackwood himself placed a telephone call to the manor. He spoke directly to Poirot, his voice hollow with exhaustion, stripped of the professional veneer that had concealed his anguish for so many years. "You understand," Blackwood said, his words measured and careful, "what he did to her, what he did to all of us." "I understand," Poirot replied gently. "Your mother was imprisoned not because she was mad, but because she was inconvenient. Because she loved a man beneath your father's social standing. Because she refused to disappear quietly into shame. Lord Ashworth destroyed her, not through law or reason, but through lies and cruelty. I became a policeman," Blackwood continued, his voice breaking slightly. To find a way to expose him legally. I spent 20 years gathering evidence, learning the system, positioning myself to bring him to justice through proper channels. But then Margaret contacted me, told me she had found his hidden correspondence, and I realised that all my patience, all my restraint, had been worthless. The system would protect him, it always does. So you decided to act, Poirot said, not as accusation but as statement of fact. I came here to steal what was mine by right, the proof of what he had done. I didn't intend to, Blackwood's voice fractured. When he came into the library, when he looked at me, I saw in his eyes that he didn't even recognise me. I was nothing to him. My mother's suffering, my sister's desperation, my entire life spent in pursuit of justice, it meant absolutely nothing. He looked at me as if I were merely a servant, someone beneath notice. And in that moment, Poirot said softly, 30 years of accumulated rage crystallised into a single action. Yes, the confession emerged like a prayer. The letter opener was there. I didn't even consciously decide, it simply happened. And when it was done, when I saw the blood, I realised that I had become like him, a man willing to destroy another human being without regard for consequences or morality. I had let his evil transform me into something equally monstrous. Eleanor's voice suddenly emerged in the background, frightened but alive. Blackwood had not harmed her, had in fact treated her with surprising gentleness, speaking to her about her mother's fate, about the tragedy that had shaped his life. Eleanor, intelligent and compassionate despite her youth, had begun to comprehend the profound injustice that had driven him to murder. She has done nothing wrong, Blackwood said. She is as much a victim as my mother was, though her victimization took a different form. She deserves to know the full truth about her father. Then bring her back, Poirot urged. Let her bear witness to the truth. Let her testify to what you have revealed. Your mother's memory will be honoured not through additional bloodshed, but through the exposure of what was done to her. Eleanor can ensure that the world knows Margaret Hartley's story, that it is no longer buried in shame and secrecy. There was a long silence. When Blackwood spoke again, his voice carried the weight of final resignation. I will return to the manor. I will surrender myself. But I need your assurance that her story, my mother's story, will be told, that it will not be buried again. You have my word, Poirot said. And more than that, you have my conviction that justice, true justice, requires that the truth be preserved and honoured. Your mother's suffering will not be forgotten. The line went silent. 30 minutes later, a police constable spotted Blackwood's automobile approaching the manor along the country lane, moving slowly, almost ceremonially, toward its destination. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, unharmed, and watching the landscape with, we said, the expression of someone who had glimpsed the darker dimensions of human nature and emerged, transformed by the experience. George Blackwood arrived at Ashworth Manor as dusk descended, the winter sky bleeding crimson and gold above the snow-covered grounds. He stepped from his automobile with deliberate slowness, his hands visible and empty, his expression one of profound weariness. Chief Inspector Jameson moved to arrest him immediately, but Poirot raised a hand, requesting that the confrontation occur in the library, the scene of the crime, the place where decades of anguish had finally erupted into violence. Blackwood stood before the fireplace where his rage had crystallised, his gaze fixed upon the empty chair where Lord Ashworth had sat. The household had assembled in the adjoining study at Poirot's insistence, separated from the confrontation by the connecting door, yet able to witness the final revelation. Eleanor stood between Catherine and Lady Ashworth, her hand clasped firmly in her sister's, her eyes moving between her father's killer Oakham and the stepmother who had never known the full extent of her husband's sins. You understand, Sergeant Blackwood, Poirot began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, that I must now reconstruct the crime, not merely for the purposes of justice, but for the purposes of truth. The world must know not simply what was done, but why it was done, and what circumstances led a good man to commit an act of terrible violence. Blackwood nodded, his shoulders sagging beneath the burden of accumulated years. You arrived at Ashworth Manor on Christmas evening, Poirot continued, moving slowly around the library as he spoke. Not as a police officer investigating a crime, but as a son seeking redemption for his mother's suffering. You possessed the impression of the study key provided by your sister Margaret, and you entered through that door with the intention of locating your father's hidden correspondence, evidence that would finally expose what had been done to Margaret Hartley. Yes, Blackwood said quietly. You found the hidden compartment, discovered the letters, and were in the process of removing them when Lord Ashworth entered the library. He had come down to tend to the fire himself, a departure from his usual routine which suggests perhaps he was restless, troubled by some internal anxiety. When he saw you, he did not immediately recognise you as Sergeant Blackwood, the policeman who had been investigating his household. He saw only a stranger, a trespasser. Poirot paused, allowing the moment to crystallise. And that is when something remarkable occurred. Lord Ashworth, rather than calling for servants or raising alarm, asked you who you were. He demanded an explanation for your presence in his private study, and in that moment you made a choice that would transform you from a man seeking justice into a man committing murder. I told him, Blackwood said, his voice hollow. I told him everything. I told him who I was, who my mother was, what he had done to her. I showed him the letters, the proof of his cruelty. And do you know what he did, Detective Poirot? Do you know how he responded? Poirot waited, allowing Blackwood to reveal the psychological genesis of his act. He laughed, Blackwood continued, tears streaming down his face. He actually laughed at me. He said my mother had been a foolish woman, a governess with the illusions above her. He said she had been mad, genuinely mad, and that committing her to an asylum had been an act of mercy rather than cruelty. He said that everything he had done, every lie, every manipulation, every destruction of her life, had been justified by social necessity and proper order. The raw pain in Blackwood's voice reverberated through the manor. Eleanor made a small sound of anguish, understanding finally the complete degradation her father had inflicted. The absolute refusal to acknowledge the humanity of those he had deemed beneath him. That is when I picked up the letter opener, Blackwood said, not in a moment of passion, but in a moment of perfect clarity. I realised that justice would never come through the system, that men like Lord Ashworth existed above the law by virtue of their wealth and position. So I acted. I did what the law could not do, and I do not regret it. Poirot regarded him steadily. Perhaps not, Sergeant, but you will live with it nonetheless. That is the true punishment, not prison or execution, but the knowledge of what you have become. As Chief Inspector Jameson moved forward to place handcuffs upon George Blackwood's wrists, Poirot raised his hand with sudden urgency. His expression had shifted from compassion to acute concentration, his dark eyes fixed not upon Blackwood, but upon the assembled witnesses visible through the connecting doorway. Something in the tableau had triggered recognition, some subtle discordance that demanded immediate reconsideration. "Wait," Poirot commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Inspector, I must ask you to examine Sergeant Blackwood's hands, particularly his left hand." Jameson complied, lifting Blackwood's left palm into the lamplight. There, upon the inner wrist, was a distinctive birthmark. Not a scar, as the Belgian detective had hypothesized, but a natural marking shaped vaguely like a crescent moon. More significant, there was no evidence whatsoever of the wound one would expect from handling the letter opener. No defensive cuts, no blood beneath the fingernails, despite Blackwood's confession. "Curious," Poirot murmured, his mind visibly recalibrating. "A man who has just stabbed another does not emerge with completely clean hands, Inspector. Even with water, soap could not entirely erase such evidence within the time frame we are discussing." Eleanor suddenly stepped forward from the study, her face illuminated by terrible understanding. "He's protecting someone," she said quietly. "He confessed to a crime he did not commit to protect someone he loves." The accusation hung suspended in the library's charged atmosphere. Blackwood's expression collapsed entirely, his entire body convulsing with silent sobs. From the study doorway, Margaret emerged, moving with the gait of someone walking toward inevitable doom. "It was I," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "George came here with the intention you described, Detective Poirot, but I followed him. I had suffered 30 years as well, watching my brother destroy himself with his obsession, watching our mother's memory become nothing more than fuel for his rage. When he found the letters, when he began to read them aloud, I could not bear it. The words, the casual cruelty, the absolute refusal to acknowledge our mother's humanity, it was too much. So you took the letter opener," Poirot said, understanding, crystallizing like forming upon winter water. "Yes," George was reading, his back to the door. Lord Ashworth was watching him with that expression of absolute contempt. "I simply acted. I did what my brother could not do, what the law would never do. And when it was finished, when I saw what I had done, George understood immediately. He realised that I would be destroyed by confession, that my life would be forfeit to the justice system, so he took responsibility. He crafted his narrative carefully and ensured that all evidence pointed toward him, that his position as a police officer would lend credibility to his confession. Catherine stepped forward now, her face bearing that as complex as the expression of a woman confronting the full scope of her family's tragedy. "You are my aunt," she said to Margaret with wonder. "You are my mother's sister, carrying the same burden of suffering that she carried." "I am," Margaret confirmed, "and I would do it again. Every moment that the man lived was an affront to our mother's memory, a mockery of the justice she deserved." "His death was not murder, Detective Poirot. It was correction. It was the world finally achieving balance." Poirot's expression grew grave, his usual composure strained by the moral complexity of the revelation. He turned to Chief Inspector Jameson, and the inspector saw something in the Belgian detective's eyes that transcended the typical boundaries of detective work. "Inspector," Poirot said slowly, "I must inform you that I have reached a conclusion regarding this case that presents certain difficulties for the purposes of justice. You see, I have discovered not one murderer, but two. One who acted from passion born of lifelong degradation, and one who acted from love born of familial protection. The law, I suspect, will not distinguish meaningfully between these motivations." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "Yet I also find myself contemplating whether justice, true justice, requires that all crimes be prosecuted with equal vigour, or whether some acts, however legally defined as murder, represent a correction of a more profound injustice that the law itself had failed to prevent." The library fell silent, suspended between competing definitions of right and wrong. Chief Inspector Jameson remained motionless, caught between the demands of law and the complexities of conscience. The evening had descended fully now, darkness pressing against the library windows like an accusation. Poirot moved to the fireplace, his silhouette sharp against the dying flames, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who had dedicated his life to understanding the architecture of human motivation. "The case presents itself simply to those who observe only surfaces," Poirot began, addressing both Jameson and the assembled household. "A locked room, a murdered man, a weapon, and evidence of entry and exit. From these elements, the authorities construct their narrative of culpability. Yet I have learned across my career that such surface observations frequently obscure rather than illuminate the truth of what has transpired." He turned to face them directly. "I must now explain the hidden clues that were present from the beginning, overlooked not through incompetence but through the fundamental limitation of the human mind when confronted with carefully constructed deception. Margaret's positioning as a household servant granted her access that would never be questioned. Her presence in the corridors, her movements through the manor were so utterly normal, so utterly extended, that no one perceived her as potentially significant. Poirot gestured toward the connecting door. "The lock manipulation I observed was genuine, but not in the manner I initially theorized. George Blackwood did indeed examine the locks, not to facilitate entry for murder, but to prepare an escape route for his sister. He disabled certain mechanisms, created possibilities, ensured that this crime could be committed and concealed without his direct involvement. The key impression Margaret obtained was used not by an external stranger, but by the woman herself." He moved to the desk indicating the hidden compartment. "She required the time to search for her mother's correspondence, while her brother occupied Lord Ashworth's attention in the study. The blue fabric, torn deliberately from her own dress and placed within the dead man's hand, was Margaret's signature. Her assertion that this case bore witness to something deeper than individual malice." Eleanor spoke softly, understanding dawning. "The timing. You said the crime occurred between 8 o'clock and 7:30 the next morning, but Margaret was never absent from the household, and she was never missing from her duties. How could she have possibly—" "Because," Poirot interrupted gently, "the crime did not occur at night as everyone assumed. It occurred at midday on Christmas, when Lord Ashworth traditionally retired to his library after luncheon for contemplation and correspondence. Margaret brought him tea at 1 o'clock, as was her custom. She locked the door behind her, as she frequently did to preserve his privacy, and she emerged 30 minutes later, the crime completed, her composure perfect, her position in the household utterly secure." Jameson's face paled as he grasped the implications. Then the discovery by Mrs. Hammond the following morning was the discovery of a body that had been dead for 20 hours, not merely hours as initially believed. The fire had been deliberately maintained, kept burning throughout the night and into the morning to obscure the precise time of death. Medical examination, had it been conducted with full knowledge of these circumstances, would have revealed that Lord Ashworth had been murdered on Christmas afternoon, not Christmas evening. Poirot's expression grew contemplative. Which returns us to the fundamental question that has occupied my thoughts since this revelation: whether justice demands the prosecution of those who commit legal crimes in service of correcting profound moral wrongs. Margaret Blackwood did not commit murder in a moment of passion. She committed it with deliberation, with planning, with the full cooperation of her brother. These are the traditional hallmarks of premeditation, of a crime worthy of the harshest judgment. He paused, allowing the weight of his conclusion to settle upon the assembled company. And yet I find myself reflecting upon Lord Ashworth's actions, the deliberate imprisonment of an innocent woman, the systematic destruction of a human life, the complete absence of remorse or accountability. The law in its wisdom offers no remedy for such crimes when committed by men of sufficient social position. The asylum records show no illegality. The correspondence shows merely business matters and personal decisions. Lord Ashworth committed his crimes within the boundaries of what society deemed acceptable. Poirot turned to face Jameson directly. "Inspector, you must now decide whether to prosecute those who have confessed, knowing that such prosecution will expose the full extent of Lord Ashworth's cruelty to public scrutiny. You must decide whether justice is served by punishment, or whether justice is served by truth-telling. I can solve the mystery, but I cannot solve the moral equation it presents." Jameson stood up, his badge suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had before, the weight of responsibility and choice pressing upon him with unbearable intensity. The decision, when it came, emerged not from Jameson's authority, but from the collective weight of revelation and understanding. By midnight, a statement had been prepared and transmitted to the press. A statement that detailed not only the murder of Lord Ashworth, but the systematic cruelty that had precipitated it. The correspondence regarding Margaret Hartley was released to public scrutiny, along with medical records documenting her institutionalization and the circumstances of her death. In the asylum 30 years prior, the scandal that erupted would occupy newspaper headlines for weeks, reshaping public discourse regarding the treatment of vulnerable women and the accountability of the wealthy. George Blackwood and Margaret Blackwood were never prosecuted. The evidence, properly presented within the context of Lord Ashworth's documented crimes, proved sufficient to persuade the Crown Prosecutor that pursuing the case would serve neither justice nor the public interest. The case was closed officially, with the perpetrators permitted to depart Hampshire quietly, their whereabouts afterward unknown to official records. Poirot remained at Ashworth Manor for 2 additional days, during which time he engaged in lengthy conversation with Eleanor and Catherine, facilitating a reconciliation between the sisters that transcended the barriers of legitimate and illegitimate birth. He also spent considerable time with Lady Ashworth, helping her comprehend the true nature of the man she had married, the depths of his moral corruption that had operated beneath the veneer of respectability. By the time the Belgian detective prepared to depart, the household had begun the difficult process of rebuilding itself upon foundations of truth rather than deception. On the morning of his departure, as Poirot settled into the back seat of his Bentley, Chief Inspector Jameson approached with an expression that suggested unresolved concerns. The inspector had been troubled throughout the investigation's conclusion, as if some element continued to elude his comprehension despite Poirot's meticulous explanations. "There remains one matter that troubles me," Jameson said quietly. "The fragment of blue fabric. Margaret wore grey wool throughout the household. We examined her wardrobe thoroughly. There was no blue silk dress, no recent tear that would correspond to the evidence found in Lord Ashworth's hand." Poirot smiled enigmatically, a gesture that suggested both acknowledgement and deliberate obfuscation. "Ah, yes, the blue fabric, Inspector. A most curious element indeed." "You know whose dress it came from," Jameson continued, frustration evident in his voice. "You have known since the beginning, haven't you? Yet you never disclosed the answer." "Oui, monsieur." "The answer," Poirot replied, his words measured with characteristic precision, "would have complicated an already complex investigation unnecessarily. The truth that matters, that Lord Ashworth's death was not a random act of violence but a response to documented cruelty, has been established and made public. The precise identity of the fabric's original wearer remains perhaps a secondary concern. Jameson's expression suggested he did not agree, yet he possessed no legal authority to compel further disclosure. As the Bentley began to move down the Manor's drive, the inspector called out one final question. "Will you return to Hampshire, Monsieur Poirot, should another mystery present itself?" Poirot's response emerged from the departing vehicle, his voice carrying back through the cold winter air. "Perhaps, Inspector, though I suspect that Ashworth Manor has exhausted its supply of mysteries for the present time. Yet I have learned across my career that families, particularly those built upon deception and hidden truths, possess an extraordinary capacity for generating additional complications. Should you require my assistance in the subject, you know where to find me." The Bentley disappeared into the Verg, leaving Jameson standing alone before the manor, the blue fabric's origin remaining eternally unresolved in his mind. Later, when reviewing his case files, the inspector would notice an entry in Poirot's personal notes, a single line suggesting that Eleanor Ashworth's wardrobe contained a recently mended blue silk dress, the repair work conducted with such precision that only the closest examination would reveal its existence. Yet whether Poirot had included this observation as fact, or deliberate misdirection, would remain, like so many aspects of the Christmas morning tragedy, forever beyond definitive resolution.